My name is Rachel, and for 6 years, I lived with a ghost. Not the kind you read about in Stephen King novels or watch on those paranormal investigation shows on Netflix. I'm talking about the kind of ghost that sleeps beside you every night, breathes softly in the darkness, and yet somehow isn't really there at all. That's the only way I can describe it now, looking back at everything that happened. My husband Daniel was in a coma, or at least that's what every doctor in the Minneapolis St. Paul Medical Center kept telling me. They used words like persistent vegetative state and minimal consciousness disorder, clinical terms that made my stomach twist into knots every single time I heard them. I'd sit in the consultation rooms, usually in one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs that squeaks when you shift your weight, and I'd listen to neurologists explain that while Daniel was technically alive, the possibility of meaningful recovery was, as they so delicately put it, increasingly unlikely. But here's the thing nobody tells you about being the spouse of someone in a coma. The guilt eats you alive from the inside out. Every decision becomes a moral minefield. Do you keep them on life support? Do you talk to them like they can hear you? Or does that make you feel crazier? Do you move on with your life? And if you do, does that make you a bad person? I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, my heart racing, convinced that the moment I started living again, Daniel would somehow sense my betrayal and find his way back to consciousness just to hate me for it. The irony, as I would later discover, was that Daniel had never really left me at all. He'd just been somewhere I couldn't reach him, somewhere dark and suffocating and controlled by people I thought I could trust. It started small, the kind of small that your mind tries to dismiss as coincidence or exhaustion. 3 months after Daniel's accident, I began noticing things that seemed impossible. His hospital bed, the one with the adjustable firmness settings and the beige synthetic fabric that I hated, was positioned differently some mornings. The reading lamp on his nightstand wasn't where I'd left it. Once, his favorite sweater, a ridiculous oversized thing he'd stolen from his college roommate 20 years ago and never returned, was folded and placed on the chair instead of hanging in the closet where I always kept it. I remember standing in that room, my hands shaking, trying to convince myself that the night nurse, a kind woman named Michelle who'd worked at the hospital for 14 years, might have moved things while she was administering medication. But Michelle had mentioned to me weeks earlier that she wasn't allowed to reorganize patient rooms without family permission. Hospital protocol. Everything had to stay exactly as family left it, she'd said, because some families believed that maintaining the patient's familiar environment helped with recovery, especially for patients like Daniel. I hired an agency called CarePath Solutions to come in twice a week and help with his physical therapy and personal care. They were expensive. My insurance covered maybe 40%, and I was working as a pediatric nurse at Children's Minnesota Hospital, which meant the bills were substantial enough that I started picking up extra shifts. I'd work my full schedule, then come home to change Daniel's bedding, read to him from the thriller novels we both used to love, and talk about everything and nothing like he could understand every word. The CarePath coordinator, a woman named Sandra with unnecessarily highlighted blonde hair and a perpetually exhausted smile, assured me that her staff was thoroughly vetted. Background checks, licensing verification, the whole process apparently took months. I believed her, because I needed to believe her. But then came the night everything changed. It was a Thursday in late autumn, right around Thanksgiving time when the Minnesota weather was turning from cool to genuinely cold. I'd been working a double shift at the hospital, helping manage a respiratory crisis with a 7-year-old patient who'd come in with severe asthma, and by the time I got home, I was absolutely exhausted. I'd gone through the motions, kissed Daniel's forehead even though I knew he couldn't feel it, changed into pajamas, and collapsed into bed. But sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept replaying the little girl's panicked breathing, the way her mother's hands shook as she signed consent forms for more aggressive treatment. I was lying there at 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling of my bedroom, when I heard it. A door closing. Not loudly, not roughly, but the soft, deliberate click of someone being careful. My heart started racing. I live alone with Daniel now. We'd converted the downstairs guest room into his medical space because the stairs to the master bedroom would have been impossible for him to navigate, and honestly, I couldn't stand the thought of carrying his completely unresponsive body up and down multiple times a day. So whoever had just closed that door was either the world's stealthiest burglar or someone with access to my home. I got out of bed slowly, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and grabbed the first thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy ceramic desk lamp from my nightstand. I know, it sounds ridiculous now, but in that moment, survival instinct takes over and rationality gets left behind like forgotten luggage at an airport. I crept down the hallway, and that's when I heard voices. Whispered voices coming from Daniel's room. My legs felt like they were filled with cement as I moved toward the door, my lamp held up like some pathetic, desperate Florence Nightingale ready for battle. I pressed my ear against the wood and heard something that made my blood literally feel cold in my veins. Someone was talking to Daniel. Not at him like I did, but to him, like he could respond, like he could understand. And then I heard a sound I'll never forget as long as I live, the unmistakable sound of Daniel's voice. Not a groan or a reflex, but actual words, slurred and weak but absolutely, unmistakably human words. My husband said, "Please don't tell her." The lamp fell from my hand and crashed onto the hardwood floor with a sound like thunder in a cathedral. I shoved the door open, and what I saw in that room rewired my entire understanding of reality. There was a man standing beside Daniel's bed, someone I recognized immediately because I'd seen him 100 times before. It was Marcus, Daniel's best friend from college, the man who'd been coming to visit Daniel for moral support every few weeks since the accident. He was wearing surgical gloves and a mask, and he was holding something that looked like a syringe. Behind him, bent over Daniel's foreline, was someone else I knew, someone I'd trusted. It was Dana, Daniel's ex-fiancée from before we'd even met, who'd somehow reappeared in our lives about 2 years before Daniel's accident. She claimed she'd wanted to make amends for how their relationship had ended. Daniel had been skeptical, but he was always the type of man who believed people could change, who saw the best in situations even when all evidence suggested otherwise. I think that's what got him into this mess in the first place. Dana looked up at me, and I swear I saw something like satisfaction flash across her face. She was beautiful in that particular way that made you hate her even before you had a good reason to. Dark hair, sharp cheekbones, the kind of effortless elegance that came from money and good genes working together like a perfectly rehearsed dance. She smiled at me, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said something that I will hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. She said, "Rachel, you're supposed to be asleep." The implication hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't something they were doing occasionally. This was a routine, a pattern. They had expected me to be unconscious. I looked at Daniel, and what I saw broke my heart in a way I didn't know was possible. His eyes were open, not wide open, but open, aware. His gaze moved from Dana to me, and I saw something that looked like desperate pleading mixed with profound shame. He tried to speak again, his jaw moving with obvious effort, and managed to say, "Rachel, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The room started to spin. Everything I'd believed about the past 6 years, every decision I'd made, every sacrifice, every moment I'd spent sitting beside what I thought was my husband's empty shell, it all suddenly felt like it had been built on a foundation of lies so thick and so comprehensive that I couldn't even see where the ground began. I made a decision in that moment that I've questioned 1,000 times since. Instead of screaming, instead of calling the police, instead of doing any of the rational things a reasonable person would do when discovering their entire reality is false, I very calmly said, "Everyone stay exactly where you are." Then I took out my phone and started recording. Marcus made a move like he was going to grab my phone, but I'd already backed toward the door, my mind operating on some kind of autopilot that fear had activated. "I wouldn't," I said, and my voice sounded like someone else's. Cold. Dangerous. "I'm a witness now, and so is Daniel. Anything you do to me goes straight to my cloud backup, which is automatically synced to multiple devices. You want to explain to a jury what that syringe in your hand was for, Marcus?" I don't know where that confidence came from. Maybe from years of dealing with agitated parents at the hospital. Maybe from some deep well of strength I didn't know I possessed. Or maybe from the pure, crystalline anger that was beginning to build in my chest like a volcano accumulating pressure before an eruption. Dana's face had gone pale. She set down whatever she was holding very carefully, her hands raised slightly, like someone approaching a wild animal. "Rachel, you don't understand," she started, but I cut her off. "No, you know what? I'm going to understand. You're going to explain everything. But first, Marcus is going to call 911. We're going to tell them that Daniel needs immediate medical evaluation. And then we're all going to sit down and have a very honest conversation about what's been happening in this house for the past 6 years. Because clearly my husband is conscious. Which means he's been conscious for longer than I thought. Which means you've been doing something to keep him this way, and I want to know exactly what that something is." The next hours were a blur of sirens and police officers and medical personnel rushing through my home with the intensity of an invasion. Daniel was transported to Hennepin Healthcare, one of the largest trauma centers in the Midwest, where they ran every test imaginable. Neurological scans, blood work, toxicology panels, the works. And here's where the story takes a turn that's almost more disturbing than anything I'd witnessed that night. The tests showed that Daniel had been receiving regular injections of midazolam, a benzodiazepine commonly used for sedation in medical settings. It's the kind of drug that's easy to justify giving to someone in a coma. It supposedly helps keep them calm, prevents seizures, reduces agitation. But when you give it to someone who's actually conscious, it induces a state of profound sedation combined with short-term memory loss. You're aware enough to perceive what's happening around you, but not coherent enough to really fight back or remember details clearly afterward. The doctors told me that in small doses, administered regularly over months and years, it could mimic the appearance of a true comatose state. Your eyes might open slightly in response to stimuli. Your body might have reflex reactions. But you'd be trapped in a fog so thick that escape seemed impossible. Someone was keeping him sedated intentionally. Dr. Patel, the neurologist assigned to Daniel's case, told me in a conference room that smelled like hand sanitizer and despair. And whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. This required medical knowledge, access to pharmaceutical supplies, and absolutely no ethical boundaries whatsoever. That's when they arrested Dana and Marcus. The police found financial records showing that Dana had been embezzling money from Daniel's trust fund, money he'd inherited from his father, for the past 4 years. And Marcus, according to the investigation, had been Dana's accomplice since the beginning. Apparently, they'd met through some online community dedicated to revenge against exes, a dark corner of the internet where people traded stories about how they'd hurt people who'd hurt them. Dana's story was that Daniel had broken her heart. Completely ordinary heartbreak, the kind that happens to millions of people every day. But Dana had decided that instead of moving on, she'd orchestrate something so elaborate, so time-consuming, and so fundamentally cruel that it would destroy him completely. If Daniel regained consciousness, which he would have eventually, according to the doctors, because the human body sometimes heals itself even when medical professionals say it won't, he'd wake up to find that 6 years of his life had vanished. His business had failed in his absence. His friends had moved on. His family had grown weary of visiting. And his wife, the person he'd married in a beautiful ceremony in Austin, Texas, 5 years before the accident, would be completely and utterly alone. The perfect revenge, from Dana's perspective. Destroy him slowly. Make him watch his own life disintegrate while he was helpless to stop it. And make money off the process too, because why not? Multitasking your evil. I sat in the interrogation observation room while the police questioned Dana, watching her through the one-way glass. She had a lawyer now, some expensive criminal defense attorney from St. Paul who wore $3,000 suits and looked perpetually disgusted by everything around him. Dana wasn't talking much, which was smart on her lawyer's part, but I saw her face in moments when she thought nobody was watching. She didn't look remorseful. She looked angry, like she was the victim in this scenario, like Daniel had somehow done something to her that justified what she'd put him through. I think that's when I finally understood something fundamental about human nature. Some people can't accept responsibility for their own pain. They need to distribute it. They need to make sure that someone else suffers proportionally to what they've suffered. It makes them feel balanced.
Fair.
Like the universe is operating according to some kind of cosmic justice that only they can perceive. But the universe doesn't work that way. Life isn't a mathematical equation where suffering cancels out suffering. It just creates more suffering, more victims, more broken pieces that can never be fully put back together. Daniel's recovery was a slow, painful process that involved weeks of intensive therapy at Shepherd Center in Atlanta, a rehabilitation facility that specializes in people coming out of medically induced sedation and comatose states. He had to relearn how to walk, how to speak clearly, how to trust his own mind again. The drugs had affected his memory significantly. He had huge gaps in his recollection of the past 6 years. Sometimes he'd ask me about things that had happened during his coma, and I'd have to tell him that he'd missed them, that those moments had occurred in a world he couldn't access. Watching the grief play across his face each time was almost worse than the original betrayal. He blamed himself for trusting Dana. He blamed himself for not somehow figuring out that he was being poisoned. He blamed himself for putting me through the ordeal of discovery, as if he'd had any choice in the matter whatsoever. It took months of couples therapy. We found a therapist named Dr. Lisa Chun who specialized in trauma recovery and relationship damage, before we could even have a conversation that didn't end with one of us in tears. The legal case dragged on for what felt like forever. Dana and Marcus both pleaded guilty to charges that included elder abuse, financial exploitation, and administering drugs with intent to harm. They each received sentences of 12 years in prison. 12 years seemed simultaneously too short and too long. Too short because Daniel had lost 6 years of his life. Too long because I didn't want to spend any more energy thinking about them at all. But that's the thing about revenge and trauma. You don't get to decide when you're done processing it. It comes back unexpectedly. You'll be at the grocery store in the flour and baking aisle, and suddenly you're remembering the way Dana smiled when she thought I couldn't see her. You'll hear a song on the radio that was playing the night of the discovery, and your heart will start racing like you're living through it all over again. Months turned into years. Daniel and I rebuilt our marriage on a foundation that was different from before, more honest in some ways, more fragile in others. He went back to work as a software engineer at a tech company in Minneapolis, and I continued my nursing career, now with a different kind of understanding about what vulnerability really means. We traveled to places we'd always wanted to visit. We spent a week in Santa Fe, New Mexico, exploring the art galleries and eating the best green chili I've ever tasted. We took a couple's retreat to Sedona, Arizona, where we hiked Camelback Mountain and watched the sunset paint the red rocks in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible. But there was always this underlying current of something unresolved, some wound that hadn't fully scarred over. I'd lie awake some nights, even though Daniel was sleeping peacefully beside me, and I'd think about how close I'd come to losing him completely. Not to death, but to something worse, to a living death where the world moved on without him. I'd think about how many other people might be experiencing something similar right now, somewhere in America, in some house where no one is checking too carefully, where a quiet person in a quiet room isn't quite as deceased as everyone believes. 1 year after Daniel's discharge from rehabilitation, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my life in ways I couldn't have predicted. I started this channel, All of Revenge Stories, because I realized that my story wasn't unique. It was the extreme end of a spectrum, certainly, but the underlying elements were disturbingly common. People being harmed by those they trust. People being gaslit about their own reality. People being victimized by elaborate schemes that took months or years to execute. I've interviewed dozens of other women who've experienced their own versions of betrayal. There's Michelle from Wisconsin, whose business partner systematically drove her company into the ground while stealing millions in revenue. There's Jennifer from Texas, whose husband had been having an affair with her best friend for 7 years while maintaining an elaborate double life. There's Catherine from California, who discovered that her live-in caregiver had been gradually poisoning her elderly mother with antifreeze to speed up her inheritance. The stories are different in their specifics, but they follow similar patterns. Trust broken, reality questioned, justice pursued, and then the long, difficult work of rebuilding. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. The aftermath of going public with my story was complicated. Some people were supportive. I got messages from women who said my story had helped them recognize warning signs in their own relationships, that hearing my experience had given them the courage to reach out to authorities or to leave dangerous situations. I was featured in a podcast called True Crime Junkie that has a massive audience, and I got recognized a few times at my local Target in Minneapolis when I was just trying to buy paper towels and cleaning supplies. But other people were cruel. There were internet trolls who suggested that I'd made the whole thing up for attention. There were people who said Daniel must have done something to deserve what happened to him. There were conspiracy theorists who claimed that Dana and Marcus were innocent and that the whole thing was a government cover-up, which doesn't even make logical sense, but somehow circulated on Reddit and TikTok anyway. I learned very quickly that truth doesn't inoculate you against criticism or disbelief. Sometimes the most outlandish stories are the most true. And sometimes people would rather cling to a comfortable lie than accept an uncomfortable reality. The AI tool I use to help edit my podcast content, a program called Descript that uses artificial intelligence to transcribe and edit audio, made the technical side of content creation much more manageable. I could focus on the storytelling instead of being bogged down by the mechanical aspects. There were also tools like Loom for recording screen shares of documents and evidence, and Asana for organizing my research across multiple stories. Technology, it turned out, could be either a weapon or a tool for healing, depending on how you used it. I started getting contacted by lawyers who wanted me to consult on cases. I was asked to speak at a conference in Denver, Colorado about recognizing abuse and manipulation. I gave a talk at the University of Minnesota about trauma recovery that was attended by psychology students and social workers and nurses who were hungry for understanding. My story had become useful in a way I hadn't anticipated. It was proof. It was evidence. It was a template that helped other people understand their own experiences. About 2 years after the legal case concluded, I was contacted by a woman named Lisa from Kentucky. She'd been watching my videos, and she recognized patterns in her own life that matched what I described. Her husband had recently woken from what everyone believed was a permanent coma. He'd confessed to her that he'd been conscious the entire time, that he'd been poisoned by his brother, who'd been having an affair with Lisa and had wanted the brother out of the picture. The case was still ongoing, and Lisa was terrified. She was afraid of her own family now, afraid of what might have happened if she hadn't reached out to me. We video called for 3 hours, and I walked her through everything: how to document evidence, how to approach law enforcement, how to protect herself legally and emotionally. I gave her the contact information for Dr. Chun, my therapist, because she worked with several therapists across the country who specialized in trauma recovery. I connected her with a support group for people who'd experienced medical abuse. I felt, in that moment, like maybe all of this pain and chaos and publicity had been worth something. If my story could save someone else from experiencing what I'd experienced, then the nightmare had meaning.
Fast forward to today.
Daniel and I have been together for 14 years total now, married for 9 of those. We bought a house in Bloomington, Minnesota, not far from where his parents live. We have 2 dogs, a golden retriever named Bailey, and a scrappy little terrier mix we rescued from an animal shelter in St. Paul called Rescue Me Dog Rescue. We talk about adopting children, though we haven't taken the plunge yet. Daniel still has some lingering effects from his ordeal. He experiences occasional anxiety and some memory gaps that probably won't ever fully resolve. But he's here. He's present. He's alive in every sense of the word that matters. And I'm grateful for him every single day in a way that people who haven't come close to losing someone can't really understand. The channel continues to grow. Other women keep reaching out with their stories. Some of them involve elaborate manipulation. Some involve financial abuse. Some involve physical violence. Each story is different, but each one contains that same core element of betrayal from someone who is supposed to be trustworthy. I've learned that this is how people get hurt.
Not always by strangers.
Often by the people closest to them. the people we invite into our homes, the people we trust with our vulnerabilities, the people we love. So here's what I want to leave you with today. And this is something I've had to learn over and over again through my own pain and through hearing the stories of countless other women. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, if something doesn't add up, if you notice patterns that don't make sense, don't dismiss it. Don't convince yourself that you're being paranoid or oversensitive. Your gut is often detecting things that your conscious mind hasn't fully processed yet. Pay attention to that voice. Document things if you're concerned. Take screenshots. Keep journals. Save voicemails. Create a paper trail. And if you think you're in danger, or if someone you love might be in danger, reach out to authorities. There's no such thing as overreacting when it comes to protecting yourself and the people you care about. And be kind to yourself through the process. Recovery isn't linear. You'll have good days and bad days. You'll move forward and then suddenly find yourself back at the beginning. That's not weakness. That's what healing actually looks like. It's messy and complicated, and it takes longer than you want it to, but you survive it. People are more resilient than they think. And stories have the power to help us all survive together. Subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories. Share this content with people you care about. Let's keep these conversations happening. Because silence is where evil gets to grow unchecked. And light, even the small light of one story shared honestly, can illuminate the darkest corners.